Western Hale owns everything a man could want in Texas Hill Country. His 10,000-acre ranch stretches beyond the horizon, his stables house champion quarter horses, and his bank account could buy half the county. At 42, he commands respect wherever his polished boots touch ground, yet every morning he wakes up empty. The money came easy after his brother died. Real estate deals, oil rights, cattle contracts. Weston built an empire on grief, mistaking success for healing. His days blur together in boardrooms and business dinners, surrounded by people who want something from him. Then June Marlowe trespasses on his land, chasing a wounded colt with dirt under her fingernails and wildflowers in her hair. She lives in a shack, works for scraps, and asks questions that cut straight through his polished armor. This poor girl sees something in Weston that he thought died with his brother. But what happens when the one person who shows you how to live starts slipping away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany desk sat untouched in the corner of Weston's study, a monument to memories he couldn't face. Every morning for 3 years, he'd walked past it on his way to the modern glass desk where he conducted his business empire. The mahogany had belonged to his younger brother Clay, solid, dependable Clay, who'd always believed in working with your hands and keeping your word. Weston stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his ranch house, coffee cooling in his hand as he surveyed. His domain, the Hale Ranch, stretched 20 miles in every direction, a testament to what money could accomplish when grief provided the fuel. Oil derricks dotted the distant horizon like mechanical prayers, pumping liquid gold from beneath the Texas soil. His prize-winning quarter horses grazed in pristine pastures, their bloodlines worth more than most folks' homes. The house itself commanded respect, 12,000 square feet of limestone and timber, with cathedral ceilings and imported marble. Floors that echoed with emptiness. Every room had been featured in architectural magazines, every detail carefully selected by expensive designers who understood aesthetics, but nothing about the man who lived there. Morning, boss. Ranch foreman Miguel Santos appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, weathered face showing the kind of lines that came from honest work under an honest sun. At 65, Miguel had worked for the Hale family longer than anyone, first for Weston's father, then watching both boys grow into men. "Stock report," Weston said, not turning from the window. "Business first, always business." It kept the other thoughts at bay. 700 head ready for market. Johnson's offering top dollar again, but I think we can do better at the Fort Worth. Auction. Miguel's voice carried the careful respect of a man who understood his employer's moods. "That new mare dropped her foal yesterday. Healthy filly, good bloodlines." Weston nodded, processing the information with the detached efficiency that had made him wealthy. Numbers were clean, predictable. Unlike people, they didn't leave holes in your chest when they disappeared. The phone buzzed against the glass desk. "Hale, Weston, darling." The voice belonged to Victoria Ashford, daughter of the state's largest oil family and Weston's occasional companion at society functions. Beautiful, accomplished, and perfectly suited for the role of ranch wife, if Weston had possessed the capacity to care about such things. "The charity gala is next weekend. You promised you'd escort me." He had forgotten entirely. These events blurred together in his mind. Expensive clothes, expensive wine, expensive conversations about nothing that mattered. Of course. "Send me the details." "Wonderful." "And Weston, wear the navy suit. It brings out your eyes." She hung up before he could respond, confident in the way of women who'd never been denied anything they wanted. Miguel cleared his throat. "That oil survey team wants to start drilling on the north section next week. Question is whether you want to keep leasing that strip to the Marlowe woman." Weston turned from the window. "Marlowe? Lives in that old line shack about 5 miles. Out. Her grandfather used to work for your daddy back in the day. Girl pays her rent regular, keeps to herself mostly. But the oil boys say there's black gold under that patch. The name meant nothing to Weston. His property was vast enough that he couldn't keep track of every tenant or hired hand. Money flowed in from dozens of sources: oil leases, cattle sales, real estate investments, government contracts. Each deal was processed by his accountants and lawyers, reducing human complexity to profit margins. How much is the lease worth? $200 a month. Oil rights could be worth 50 times that, maybe more. Weston calculated automatically. The arithmetic was simple, the choice obvious. Business was business, and sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Serve her notice. We'll need that land clear before they start drilling. Yes, sir. Miguel hesitated at the doorway. Boss, you might want to ride out there yourself before we send the papers. Sometimes it's better to handle these things personal-like. After Miguel left, Weston returned to the windows, but his reflection stared back instead of the landscape beyond. At 42, he looked successful. Silver threading his dark hair, expensive clothes fitting his tall frame perfectly, the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and country clubs. Yet something in his eyes had gone cold after Clay's accident, something that no amount of money had been able to warm. Clay would have ridden out to meet this Marlowe woman personally, would have found a way to make the transition easier for her. Clay had always been the brother with heart, while Weston possessed the head for business. Together, they'd planned to build something meaningful from their father's legacy. Apart, Weston had built only wealth. The mahogany desk seemed to watch him from its corner, patient as a gravestone. Clay's last project, architectural plans for a children's hospital, still lay rolled in its bottom drawer, dreams abandoned when the pickup truck skidded off a rain-slick highway one November night. Weston finished his coffee, cold now and bitter. He had calls to make, contracts to review, an empire to maintain. The Marlowe woman would find another place to live, and the oil would flow, and the numbers in his accounts would grow larger. It was just business after all. It was always just business. The injured colt limped through the fence line just after dawn, trailing blood and fear in equal measure. Weston noticed it from his study window, a young paint horse, maybe 2 years old, favoring its left foreleg as it wandered deeper onto Hale property. Wild horses weren't uncommon in this part of Texas, but something about this one's purposeful movement suggested it wasn't entirely wild. He was reaching for his phone to call Miguel when movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the mesquite, brush, moving with the fluid grace of someone who understood how to approach frightened animals. The morning sun created a silhouette, slight build, long hair escaping from beneath a worn baseball cap, clothes that had seen better decades. The woman, he could see now it was definitely a woman, approached the colt with infinite patience, her hands visible and empty, her voice carrying across the distance in soothing tones he couldn't quite make out. The horse's ears swiveled toward her, tension leaving its frame as she drew closer. Weston found himself watching, coffee forgotten in his hand. There was something mesmerizing about the scene, the careful dance between human and animal. Trust, being built one breath at a time. The woman knelt beside the injured leg, her examination gentle but thorough, completely absorbed in her task. That's when she looked up and saw him standing in the window. Even from a distance, Weston felt the impact of her direct gaze. No hesitation, no deference to the obvious wealth surrounding her. She simply acknowledged his presence with a brief nod and returned her attention to the horse. By the time Weston pulled on his boots and walked outside, she had fashioned a makeshift lead rope from what looked like baling twine and was preparing to move the colt. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with sun-streaked brown hair and the kind of tan that came from working outdoors rather than lying by swimming pools. "You're trespassing," Weston said, though something about the way she handled the injured animal took the edge off his words. She glanced up, dirt smudged on her cheek, wildflower stems caught in her hair. "I know. Sorry about that. Thunder here has a talent for wandering where he shouldn't." Her voice carried a soft drawl, the kind that spoke of roots that ran deep in Texas soil. "Thunder? My neighbor's colt. Well, sort of my neighbor. Old Pete Jenkins lives about 3 miles that way. She gestured vaguely toward the horizon. This little guy likes to explore, but he's not much for watching where he steps. Looks like he tangled with some barbed wire. Weston studied the woman more carefully. Her clothes were clean but patched, boots worn but well cared for. Everything about her spoke of making do with what you had, of finding ways to stretch $1 until it screamed. Yet there was no apology in her manner, no subservience in the face of his obvious wealth. You seem to know what you're doing, he observed. Grew up around horses. My granddad always said they're just like people. They'll tell you everything. You need to know if you're willing to listen. She ran her hand along Thunder's neck, and the colt leaned into her touch. This cut's not too deep, but it needs cleaning. Pete's probably worried sick. Something about her easy competence and genuine concern for the animal stirred a memory in Weston. Clay, age 12, staying up all night with a sick foal, refusing to leave its side until the veterinarian arrived. Clay had possessed that same natural connection with animals, that same instinctive understanding of what needed to be done. I could call my veterinarian, Weston offered, surprising himself. The woman, he realized he didn't even know her name, smiled for the first time, and it transformed her entire face. That's kind of you, but Pete can't afford fancy vet bills. I've got supplies back at my place that'll do just fine. Thunder's going to be good as new in a week or 2. Your place? Little cabin about 5 miles north. I rent from you, actually. June Marlowe. She extended a dirt-stained hand without self-consciousness. Guess that makes you Mr. Hale. Weston shook her hand, noting the calluses and the firm grip. This was the tenant Miguel had mentioned, the one whose land the oil company wanted. Standing here in his manicured yard, surrounded by wealth she couldn't begin to imagine, she showed no trace of intimidation or false deference. You're away from home, he said. Thunder doesn't much care about property lines when he's hurting. June's tone was matter-of-fact. Animals have their own rules about what matters and what doesn't. As if to prove her point, the colt nuzzled against her shoulder, completely trusting despite his injury. Weston watched the interaction, noting how naturally she moved with the animal, how her presence seemed to calm its distress. Well, June said, gathering the makeshift lead rope, I should get this fellow home before Pete sends out a search party. Thank you for not running us off with a shotgun. Do you get run off often? Another smile, this one tinged with something that might have been sadness. More often than you'd think. Folks around here aren't much used to seeing someone like me. On property like this, she began leading Thunder toward the fence line, moving slowly to accommodate his injured gait. Weston found himself walking alongside them, though he couldn't have said why. Someone like you? June paused at the fence, studying his face as if trying to decide whether he was genuinely curious or simply making conversation. Poor, she said, finally, with the kind of honesty that hit like a splash of cold water. Poor folk make rich folk nervous, like poverty might be catching. 3 days later, Weston found himself riding toward the north section of his property, ostensibly to check on fence repairs, but truthfully drawn by curiosity about the woman who'd spoken so plainly about poverty and property lines. He told himself it was business. He needed to assess the land before the oil survey team arrived, but the eviction notice remained unsigned on his desk. He found June Marlowe sitting on the porch of what could generously be called a cabin. The structure leaned slightly to the left, its tin roof patched with squares of different metals that created a patchwork pattern against the sky. But the small yard was meticulously maintained, with wildflowers growing in coffee cans and mason jars, creating splashes of color that somehow made the humble dwelling seem intentional rather than makeshift. She was drinking from a dented tin cup, watching Thunder graze in a makeshift paddock beside the house. The colt's leg was wrapped with clean bandages, and he moved without the painful limp Weston remembered. Mr. Hale. June didn't seem surprised to see him. Thunder's doing much better, thanks for asking. Weston dismounted, tying his horse to a fence post. I wasn't asking, but I'm glad to hear it. No. Then what brings the landlord out to check on his most remote tenant? She took another sip from the tin cup, and something about the simple gesture struck him as graceful despite the humble vessel. "Business," Weston said, then found himself adding, "Curiosity. About poor folk?" Her directness continued to catch him off guard. Most people approached him with careful deference, weighing their words to avoid offense or to gain advantage. June Marlowe seemed incapable of anything but honesty. "About people who aren't afraid of me." June studied his face for a long moment. "Why would I be afraid of you? You're just a man with more money than most. Most people find the money intimidating. Money's just a tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver, useful for certain jobs, but it doesn't make the person holding it any better or worse than anyone else." She gestured toward the second chair on her porch, a lawn chair with frayed strapping that had seen better years. "You want some coffee? It's not fancy, but it's hot." Weston surprised himself by accepting. June disappeared into the cabin and returned with another tin cup, this one even more dented than her own. She poured coffee from a thermos, black and strong enough to wake the dead. "No cream or sugar," she said apologetically. "Luxuries come after necessities in my budget." The coffee was actually excellent, rich and bold, with a slightly smoky flavor that spoke of careful brewing. Weston found himself relaxing into the uncomfortable chair, listening to the sounds of birds and wind that his climate-controlled house had insulated him from. "What do you do for work?" he asked. "Whatever needs doing. Clean houses in town on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Help with roundup when the neighboring ranches need extra hands. Fix things that are broken. Tend to animals that are hurt." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Survival's a full-time job when you're doing it on a shoestring." "That doesn't sound like much of a life." June's eyebrows rose. "Doesn't it? I wake up when the sun tells me to, not when an alarm clock demands it. I work with my hands, help things grow, make broken things whole again. I know every wildflower within 5 miles of here, and I can tell you which ones make the best tea and which ones the butterflies prefer." "When was the last time you noticed a butterfly, Mr. Hale?" Weston couldn't remember. His days were filled. With conference calls and financial reports, his attention focused on numbers and projections rather than the natural world around him. "That's what I thought," June said gently. "You've got enough money to buy everything you could possibly want, but when did you last want something that couldn't be bought?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Weston found himself thinking about Clay, about the hospital plans still rolled up in the mahogany desk, about dreams that had died with his brother because Weston lacked the heart to pursue them alone. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who doesn't know me. Questions are free. Answers are what cost something." June's smile took any sting out of the words. "Besides, I figure a man who builds walls as high as yours might be hiding something worth finding. What makes you think I'm hiding anything? You rode all the way out here to check on a hurt horse that isn't even yours, then stayed for coffee with a woman who can't pay her bills on time. Either you're a lot lonelier than you want to admit, or you're a lot kinder than you want people to know." Weston felt exposed, as if this woman with her tin cup and patched cabin could see through the carefully constructed facade that protected him from the world. The sensation was uncomfortable and oddly liberating at the same time. "Maybe I'm just curious about people who choose to live like this." "Choose?" June laughed, a sound with more sadness than humor. "Mr. Hale, most folks don't choose poverty any more than they choose the color of their eyes. Life happens, and you make the best of what you're given. Then why do you seem so content?" June set down her cup and looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its afternoon descent. "Because contentment isn't about what you have. It's about knowing what actually matters." When June invited Weston inside her cabin, he expected squalor. What he found instead was a masterclass in making do with grace. The single room was spotlessly clean, every surface scrubbed until it gleamed, despite the obvious age of everything within. Sunlight streamed through windows so clean they seemed absent, illuminating a space that should have felt cramped, but somehow didn't. The focal point was a hand-sewn quilt draped over what appeared to be the room's only bed. The pattern was intricate. A double wedding ring design in blues and golds that seemed to capture and hold the afternoon light. Every stitch was perfectly placed, the kind of work that spoke of countless hours and infinite patience. "My grandmother's," June said, noticing his attention. "She made it for her hope chest when she was 16, dreaming of the man she'd marry someday. Took her 3 years to finish, working by lamplight after her chores were done." Weston approached the quilt, drawn by the craftsmanship. His expensive sheets at home were Egyptian cotton with thread counts that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but they possessed none of the warmth and history he felt radiating from this simple bed cover. "It's beautiful," he said, meaning it. "Grandmama used to say that the love you put into making something was what made it valuable, not the price of the materials." June's fingers traced one of the golden rings. "She made this with flour sack fabric and scraps from other projects. Fed a family of 6 through the Depression on what most folks would call nothing, but she never considered herself poor." Michou. Rest of the cabin told a similar story. Mason jars lined makeshift shelves, filled with dried herbs and wildflower seeds. A small, wood-burning stove sat in one corner, its surface blackened with use but polished to a shine. Books were stacked everywhere, library discards and paperbacks with broken spines, their pages yellow with age, but clearly well-loved. In the corner opposite the bed, a collection of injured animals occupied various makeshift enclosures. A one-legged crow perched in a cage, fashioned from chicken wire and scrap wood. A box held what appeared to be baby rabbits, their eyes still closed. A larger pen contained a raccoon with a bandaged paw. "Your neighbors?" Weston asked. June laughed, checking the water dish for the baby rabbits. "Temporary boarders. Folks bring me whatever they find hurt or orphaned. I patch them up and send them back to the wild when they're ready." "Do you charge for this veterinary service?" "Charge?" June looked genuinely puzzled. "You don't charge someone for doing what's right. These creatures didn't ask to be hurt. Helping them is just what you do." Weston watched her tend to the animals with the same gentle competence she'd shown with Thunder. Her movements were economical but caring, each gesture informed by experience and genuine concern. The raccoon chittered softly as she changed its bandage, showing no fear of her. "Dutch, how long have you lived like this?" "Since I was 22. Lost my job at the bank in town when they downsized, lost my apartment when I couldn't make rent. Old Pete Jenkins knew my granddad, offered me this place for almost nothing. Been here 8 years now. 8 years of living in a space smaller than Weston's walk-in closet. Yet June showed no trace of bitterness or self-pity. If anything, she seemed more at peace than anyone he knew, including himself. "Don't you want more?" June paused in her ministrations to the raccoon. "More what? Space, comfort, security. I have space. All of Texas Hill Country is my backyard. I have comfort, a dry roof, warm bed, and good coffee. As for security," she shrugged. "Nothing in this world is really secure, is it? People with mansions and millions lose everything in a heartbeat. At least I know I can survive on very little." She moved to the window, where dozens of wildflowers grew in containers made from everything imaginable. Coffee cans, mason jars, old boots with holes punched in the bottom for drainage. The effect was chaotic but beautiful, like a garden that had exploded in slow motion. "These are my real wealth," June said, touching the petals of a purple bloom Weston couldn't identify. "Indian paintbrush, blue bonnets, evening primrose. They seed themselves if you let them, come back stronger every year. You can't buy this kind of beauty. It only grows when it's wanted, not when it's demanded." Weston found himself thinking about his own meticulously landscaped grounds, maintained by a crew of professionals who replaced anything that didn't conform to the designer's vision. Beautiful, certainly, but sterile. None of it had grown because it wanted to be there. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. Used to tell me that the difference between rich and poor wasn't about money. It was about knowing what you already had. June's smile held both love and loss. She'd find something to appreciate in a rusty nail if she looked hard enough. Is that what you're doing? Finding something to appreciate in a rusty nail? June's eyes met his directly. I'm still deciding whether you're the rusty nail or something that could be polished up into something useful. The honesty of it struck Weston like a physical blow. In his world, people approached him with calculated agendas, their true opinions, carefully hidden behind layers of diplomacy and self-interest. June Marlowe seemed incapable of anything but truth, even when it might offend. And what would determine the difference? Whether you're willing to be polished, she said simply. Some things are too set in their rust to change. 2 weeks passed before Weston returned to June's cabin, though he'd thought about their conversation every day. When he did visit, he brought supplies, veterinary-grade bandages, antibiotic ointment, and a bag of high-quality feed for her menagerie of wounded creatures. He told himself it was practical, but the truth was more complicated. June accepted the gifts with the same matter-of-fact grace she showed everything else, neither effusive in gratitude nor suspicious of his motives. She simply integrated the supplies into her care routine and invited him to stay for coffee. This time, when she asked about his life, Weston found himself answering with uncharacteristic honesty. "My brother died 3 years ago," he said, the words emerging without permission. "Car accident. He was coming back from a meeting about a children's hospital he wanted to build." June set down her tin cup, giving him her complete attention. "You were close. Closer than most brothers. Clay was..." Weston struggled for words. "He was the heart of everything we planned to do with the family business. I handled the money side, he handled the human side. Together, we were going to build something meaningful." "What happened to the hospital?" "Nothing. The plans are still in his desk. I can't even bear to look at them." June was quiet for a long moment, watching the rescued raccoon tentatively explore beyond its enclosure. What would Clay think about that? The question hit harder than any accusation could have. Weston knew exactly what Clay would think, that Weston was hiding behind grief, using it as an excuse to avoid the vulnerable work of caring about people and causes beyond himself. He'd be disappointed, Weston admitted. "Then why don't you build it?" "Because I don't know how to do what he did." Clay could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they mattered. He could talk to children and make them laugh when they were scared. He could convince donors to give not because they wanted recognition, but because they believed in the dream. Weston's voice grew quiet. "I'm good at making money. That's all I'm good at." June stood and walked into the cabin, returning with something in her hands. It was a photograph, creased and faded, showing 2 young boys on horseback. Weston recognized it immediately, though he hadn't seen it in years. "Where did you get this?" "Found it in the creek bed after that storm last month. Figured it must have blown off someone's property." June studied the image. "These boys look happy." Weston stared at the picture of himself and Clay at ages 10 and 8. Mounted on their father's gentlest horses, grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of children who believed the world was full of possibilities. Clay's arm was thrown around Weston's shoulders, both of them covered in dirt from a day spent exploring every corner of the ranch. "We were," he said softly. "Back then, everything seemed possible. What changed? We grew up." Clay stayed optimistic. "I learned to be careful." June took the photograph and held it up to the light, as if searching for something hidden in its shadows. "You know what I see when I look at this? 2 kids who didn't know how hard life was going to get. I see 2 boys who were best friends, who trusted each other completely, who shared everything." She handed the photo back to him. "That doesn't just disappear because one of them dies, Mr. Hale. That love doesn't evaporate." Weston felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built brick by careful brick beginning to crumble. The photograph seemed to burn in his hands, radiating memories he'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. How do you carry love for someone who isn't there anymore? By doing the things they would have done. By being the person they believed you could be. June's voice was gentle but firm. Your brother saw something in you worth partnering with. Maybe instead of hiding from that, you should trust his judgment." The words hung between them like a bridge. Weston wasn't sure he was brave enough to cross. For 3 years, he'd told himself that building the hospital without Clay would be a betrayal of their partnership. But sitting in June's humble home, surrounded by evidence of her daily acts of compassion, he began to wonder if the real betrayal was in doing nothing at all. "I wouldn't know where to start." "You start by taking the plans out of the desk drawer," June said simply. "You start by remembering why your brother thought it mattered. You start by asking yourself what kind of man you want to be, one who builds things or one who buries them." Weston looked at the photograph again, seeing not just happy children, but the foundation of everything he and Clay had dreamed of accomplishing together. The boys in the picture wouldn't have understood the man he'd become. Wealthy but hollow, successful but isolated. It would be expensive, complicated. There would be permits, politics, fundraising. "Sounds like you're already making a list," June observed with a slight smile. She was right. His mind was already working, calculating costs and timelines, identifying obstacles and solutions. It was the first time in 3 years that he'd felt anything resembling excitement about a project. Clay always said, "I overthought everything." Maybe, but thinking things through isn't a fault if it gets you to the right place eventually. June collected their empty cups, her movements efficient and peaceful. "The question is whether you're going to think yourself into action or into more excuses." The church bell of Millbrook Baptist rang out across the town square every Sunday. At 10:30, calling the faithful to worship and the curious to gossip. This particular Sunday, both were in abundant supply, as word had spread about Western Hale's frequent visits to the north section of his property, specifically to the ramshackle cabin where June Marlowe eked out her modest existence. Weston felt the weight of scrutiny the moment he entered the church. He'd been attending sporadically since Clay's death, more out of habit than faith. But today, the familiar pews seemed to buzz with whispered conversations that died abruptly when he passed. Victoria Ashford made room for him in her family's traditional front-row seat, her smile bright and possessive. "Darling, you look tired," she murmured, as the congregation rose for the opening hymn. "You've been working too hard. Perhaps you should take a vacation, somewhere civilized." From across the aisle, Weston caught the eye of Martha Henderson, the town's most reliable source of information and opinion. Her expression suggested she had thoughts about his recent activities, none of them particularly charitable. Behind her, Tom Bradley, who owned the feed store and served as the town's unofficial moral compass, wore the concerned frown of a man who'd heard troubling reports. Pastor Williams chose that morning to speak about compassion for the less fortunate, his words carrying the particular emphasis that suggested he'd heard the same rumors as everyone else. "The measure of a man," he intoned from the pulpit, "is not found in the size of his bank account, but in the depth of his charity toward those in need." Victoria's grip tightened on Weston's arm. "Such a timely message," she whispered. "Perhaps you could increase your contribution to the church's building fund." But Weston was thinking about a different kind of charity, the quiet, unheralded care June showed to every wounded creature that crossed her path. She asked nothing in return, expected no recognition, built no monuments to her own generosity. Her compassion was as natural and necessary as breathing. After the service, the gauntlet began. Weston, son. Tom Bradley intercepted him on the church steps. His weathered face creased with paternal concern. "Heard you've been spending time out at the old Marlowe place. Is that a problem, Tom?" "Well, now, that depends. Girl's had a hard time of it, what with losing her job and all. Folks worry she might get the wrong idea about your friendship." The implication was clear enough. Rich men who visited poor women alone were assumed to have dishonorable intentions, and small towns had long memories for such scandals. What kind of wrong idea? Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Look, son, I know you've been through a rough patch since Clay died. We all understand. But that girl's got no family, no protection. Folks feel a responsibility to look out for her, if you catch my meaning." Before Weston could respond, Martha Henderson materialized at his elbow with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. "Weston Hale, I've been meaning to speak with you, Mrs. Henderson. Now I don't usually involve myself in other people's business." She paused to let this whopper settle, while Victoria rolled her eyes behind her. "But people are talking, and I feel it's my Christian duty to speak plainly." "About what?" "About that Marlowe girl. She's a sweet thing, don't get me wrong, but she's not suitable company for a man in your position. People might get ideas." "What kind of ideas?" Martha's voice dropped to a stage whisper that could be heard 3 counties away. "Well, that you might be taking advantage, or that she might be gold-digging. Either way, it reflects poorly on both of you." Victoria chose that moment to assert her claim. "Weston's much too smart to be taken in by some little fortune hunter," she said sweetly, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Aren't you, darling?" The church bell chimed again, marking the half-hour, and something about its clear, persistent tone reminded Weston of June's honesty. She'd never asked him for anything, never hinted at wanting more than she had, never treated him as anything other than a man who happened to own the land she rented. "Mrs. Henderson," Weston said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but June Marlowe is the most genuine person I've met in years. If people want to talk, perhaps they should consider what that says about them rather than about her." Martha's face flushed red. "Well, I never—" "No," Weston said quietly, "I don't think you have." He walked away, leaving Victoria to make his excuses and Martha to sputter her indignation to anyone within earshot. But he could feel the weight of the town's judgment settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Small communities had their own rules about who belonged with whom, and those rules were enforced with the relentless pressure of collective opinion. By evening, his phone was ringing with concerned calls from business associates who'd heard whispers about his situation. The implication was always the same. Wealthy men who consorted with poor women damaged their reputations and, by extension, their business relationships. The church bell's echo seemed to follow him home, its bronze voice carrying questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. In his study, Clay's desk waited in its corner, the hospital plans still hidden in the drawer. But now there was another decision to make, one that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the kind of man he wanted to be when the bell stopped ringing. The wildflower seeds arrived in June's life the way most important things did, quietly and without fanfare. She'd been collecting them for years, gathering the tiny promises of future beauty from roadsides and meadows, storing them in small envelopes labeled with her careful handwriting. Each packet represented a different species native to the Texas hill country, a living library of the land's natural heritage. When Weston arrived at her cabin the Tuesday after the church incident, he found her sitting cross-legged in the dirt, surrounded by dozens of these small envelopes. She was sorting them with the concentrated attention of a scholar, occasionally holding individual seeds up to the light to examine their condition. "Planning a garden?" he asked, dismounting from his horse. "Every day's a good day for planning." "A garden," June replied without looking up. "But today I'm thinking about legacy." Weston settled beside her, no longer self-conscious about getting dirt on his expensive clothes. "What kind of legacy comes from wildflower seeds?" June held up a packet labeled Indian Paintbrush, collected near Miller's Creek, April 2018. "This particular plant has been growing in Texas for thousands of years. The Comanche used it for medicine. Early settlers made dye from the blooms. Every seed carries all that history forward." She opened the envelope and poured a few tiny seeds into her palm. They were so small as to seem insignificant, dark specks that could easily be mistaken for debris. Hard to believe something so small could create something beautiful, Weston observed. That's the thing about faith, June said, transferring the seeds to a labeled section of an egg carton she was using for sorting. You plant something tiny and trust that nature knows what to do with it. Is that what you're doing with me? The question surprised them both. June paused in her sorting, studying Weston's face with the same careful attention she'd given the seeds. Maybe. You've got good soil under all that concrete and steel. Question is whether you're willing to let anything grow there. She stood and dusted off her hands, then gestured toward a cleared patch of ground behind her cabin. Want to help me plant some of these? I'm thinking this spot gets good morning sun. For the next 2 hours, Weston found himself on his hands and knees, learning to prepare soil for planting. June showed him how to work compost into the earth, how to judge proper spacing, how to plant seeds at just the right depth. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but she slowed her pace to match his fumbling attempts. Deeper, she said, watching him scatter bluebonnet seeds. They need to feel secure before they'll trust enough to grow. How do you know all this? My grandmother mostly. She taught me that gardening is just another way of having faith in the future. June made small holes with her finger, dropping seeds with precision. Every time you plant something, you're saying you believe tomorrow will come and be worth seeing. Weston paused in his work, dirt under his fingernails for the first time in years. I haven't thought much about the future lately, I noticed. You've been living in the past, both the good parts and the bad parts. But seeds don't grow backward, Mr. Hale. They only know how to reach toward the light. As they worked, June shared stories about each variety they planted. Evening primrose that opened only at dusk, black-eyed Susans that could survive drought and flood alike, wine cups that spread into carpets of deep red blooms. Each plant had adapted to thrive in the challenging conditions of hill country life, finding ways to flourish despite poor soil and uncertain rainfall. It's like people, June said, pressing lantana seeds into the earth. The ones who survive aren't necessarily the strongest or the prettiest. They're the ones who learn to bloom where they're planted. Is that what you've done? Tried to. Some days are better than others. She sat back on her heels, surveying their work. The planted area looked unremarkable, just disturbed soil marked with small stakes bearing seed packet labels. But I've learned that contentment isn't about having perfect conditions. It's about finding ways to grow despite imperfect ones. Weston looked at his hands. Dirty, scratched from thorns, stained with earth. They looked like working hands for the first time in years. Hands that had created something rather than simply managing what already existed. How long before we see results? Some will come up in a few weeks if we get rain. Others might wait until spring. A few might not show themselves for years. They're waiting for exactly the right conditions. June smiled at his impatience. That's another thing about faith. The timeline isn't up to you. As the afternoon sun slanted across their work, Weston found himself thinking about Clay's hospital plans. Maybe building something meaningful was like planting wildflowers, an act of faith that the future would come and be worth the effort. I've been thinking about what you said, he told June as they cleaned their tools, about taking the plans out of the drawer. And I think I'm ready to plant some seeds of my own. June's smile was radiant. That's the best news these flowers could ask for. They'll grow better knowing they're part of something larger. That evening, Weston returned home to find the eviction notice still unsigned on his desk. Instead of signing it, he walked to Clay's mahogany desk and opened the bottom drawer for the first time in 3 years. The land deed lay spread across Weston's conference table like an accusation, its legal language cold and precise. Pemberton. Oil's representatives had arrived that morning with contracts, geological surveys, and profit projections that would have impressed any reasonable businessman. The numbers were staggering. Enough money to fund Clay's hospital 3 times over. Prime drilling location, announced Richard Pemberton, Jr., a thin man whose expensive suit couldn't disguise his predatory nature. Our geologists estimate 40,000 barrels minimum, possibly twice that. At current prices, we're talking about a $20 million operation. Weston studied the survey maps, noting how the proposed drilling site encompassed not just June's small plot, but several acres around it. Red circles marked optimal drill positions, and every one of them fell within a half-mile of her cabin. What about the current tenant? Weston asked. Pemberton waved dismissively. Minor detail, standard eviction procedures, maybe a small relocation payment if she makes noise. These types usually don't fight if you handle it right. These types, poor folk. They're used to being moved around. Pemberton's assistant, a sharp-faced woman named Helen Cross, consulted her tablet. June Marlowe, age 31, unemployed except for occasional day labor. No family connections, no legal representation. She'll be gone within 30 days of notice. The casual dismissal of June's life struck Weston like a physical blow. To these people, she was nothing more than an obstacle to profit, a minor inconvenience, to be swept aside in pursuit of the black gold beneath her feet. The environmental impact? Weston found himself asking, though he'd never concerned himself with such matters before. Minimal, Pemberton assured him. Standard EPA compliance, maybe some dust during initial drilling. Nothing that affects property values in the long term. But Weston was thinking about June's wildflower garden, about the rescued animals that depended on the quiet sanctuary she'd created. He imagined drilling noise echoing across the landscape 24 hours a day, industrial trucks churning the dirt roads into muddy ruts, the peaceful refuge transformed into an industrial site. Timeline. We can start as soon as you sign. Equipment's already staged, crews are ready to move. Your legal team drafted the eviction notice, correct? Helen Cross slid a folder across the table. Just needs your signature to make it official. The eviction notice was efficient and heartless. 30 days to vacate, no negotiation, no appeal. June Marlowe was ordered to remove herself and her belongings from the premises with the threat of legal action if she failed to comply. Weston's signature would transform her from tenant to trespasser with the stroke of a pen. 20 million, Pemberton repeated, as if sensing Weston's hesitation. Enough to fund any charitable project you might have in mind. Build a dozen hospitals if that's your inclination. The mention of hospitals felt like manipulation, though Weston couldn't prove Pemberton knew about Clay's plans. Still, the timing was suspicious. Had someone been talking? In a small town, secrets were currency, and business rivals often knew, more than they should. I need time to consider this. Time is money, Mr. Hale. Market conditions, drilling schedules, equipment availability, everything's aligned right now. Wait 6 months, and the opportunity might disappear. After the oil men left, Weston sat alone with the contracts and his conscience. The money would solve every financial concern about the hospital project. Clay's dream could become reality, without risking Weston's personal fortune or requiring years of fundraising from reluctant donors. But the cost would be June's home, her sanctuary, her life as she'd built it. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Dinner tonight? I heard about your business meeting. We should celebrate your success. Success. The word tasted bitter. Weston walked to his window, looking north toward where June's cabin sat, like a small act of defiance against the modernizing world. From this distance, he couldn't see the building itself, but he knew it was there. Humble, peaceful, surrounded by wild flowers and wounded animals. His phone rang. Miguel's voice was carefully neutral. "Boss, those oil people called. Said they need an answer by Friday or the deal's off the table." "What do you think, Miguel?" A long pause. "Not my place too?" "Don't think, sir, but if it was my call, I'd ride out and talk to the girl before I decided anything permanent." Weston found himself driving toward June's cabin without conscious decision, the unsigned eviction notice on the passenger seat beside him. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that made everything look precious and temporary. He found June tending to a new arrival, a hawk with a damaged wing that someone had brought her that afternoon. She worked with infinite patience, her hands gentle but sure as she examined the injury. "Looks like he tangled with a fence," she said without looking up. "Nothing that won't heal with time and care." Weston watched her work, noting how the hawk seemed to trust her despite its obvious pain. June had that effect on wounded things. They sensed her intention to help rather than harm. "June," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name, "we need to talk." She looked up then, and something in his expression made her go very still. "About what?" Weston held up the eviction notice and watched her face change as she understood what it meant. The hawk fluttered weakly in her hands, sensing the sudden tension in the air. June's worn Bible lay open on the porch railing, its pages fluttering in the night breeze. The leather cover was cracked from years of handling, the gold lettering long since faded, but the book remained her most precious possession, a gift from her grandmother containing not just scripture, but pressed flowers, handwritten notes, and the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of strong women. It was past midnight when Weston found her sitting on her porch steps, the Bible in her lap, her face turned toward the star-scattered sky. The eviction notice lay beside her, its official language stark in the moonlight. She'd read it 3 times, each reading confirming what she'd already understood. She had 30 days to pack up her life and disappear. Couldn't sleep either, she asked without turning around. Weston dismounted from his horse, noting how June's voice carried no accusation despite the paper that bore his signature. He'd struggled for 2 hours with the decision before finally signing, telling himself that $20 million could help more people than one woman's comfort. "I kept thinking about what you'd say," he admitted, settling beside her on the steps. "About you signing my eviction notice. About choosing money over people." June closed the Bible gently, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "My grandmother used to say that every choice reveals who we really are, not who we think we are or who we want to be, but who we are when the stakes matter." The words cut deeper than any anger could have. Weston had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even fury. Instead, June offered the quiet disappointment of someone whose faith in his character had been misplaced. "The money will fund the hospital," he said, hating how defensive he sounded. "Clay's dream can become reality. At the cost of my reality, you can find another place. I'll help with relocation costs, first month's rent, wherever you want to go." June laughed, a sound empty of humor. "Mr. Hale, you still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money or convenience. This is my home." She gestured toward the darkness surrounding them. The invisible wildflower garden, the makeshift animal, enclosures, the humble cabin that had sheltered her for 8 years. "I know every bird that nests in that oak tree. I can tell you which wildflowers bloom first each spring and which ones last through the first frost. That hawk you saw me tending? His mate visits every evening, waiting for him to heal so they can fly together again." Her voice grew soft but firm. "You can't relocate a life, Mr. Hale. You can move belongings and change addresses, but you can't pack up the relationships that make a place home." Weston felt something crumble inside his chest. He'd approached the eviction as a business transaction, failing to consider the deeper connections that couldn't be quantified or replaced. "I thought I was doing the right thing. For who?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Weston realized he'd been thinking about abstract future patients who might benefit from Clay's hospital, while ignoring the real person sitting beside him whose life he was dismantling. "I'm scared," June said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "of being homeless, of dying alone." The words hit Weston like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" June opened the Bible to a page marked with a pressed violet, her grandmother's handwriting visible in the margins. "I've been having some health issues. Nothing dramatic, nothing that keeps me from working, but—" She touched her chest absently. "My heart's not as strong as it used to be. Have you seen a doctor? Can't afford the kind of doctors who deal with heart problems. Besides, some things can't be fixed with money, and some battles you fight alone whether you want to or not." Weston stared at her profile in the moonlight. seeing for the first time the subtle signs he'd missed, the careful way she moved sometimes, the brief pauses when she thought no one was watching, the occasional shortness of breath she masked. With stillness. How long have you known? About a year, maybe longer. It's hard to say when something like this starts. June's fingers traced the pressed flower in the Bible. My grandmother had the same condition. She lived with it for 20 years, died peacefully in her sleep at 87. But you're only 31. Hearts don't follow calendars, mister. Hail, they follow their own timeline. The night suddenly felt colder, the stars more distant. Weston found himself thinking about all the time he'd wasted, all the opportunities for connection he'd avoided out of fear or pride. Why are you telling me this? June closed the Bible and looked directly at him for the first time since he'd arrived. Because in 30 days I'll be gone from this place that's been my sanctuary. Because you're the only person who's shown any interest in my life beyond what I can do for them. Because I'm tired of carrying this alone. Her honesty was devastating in its simplicity. Weston realized that while he'd been worried about his reputation and business relationships, June had been facing mortality with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else. What can I do? Be my friend, she said simply, for whatever time we have. Don't treat me like I'm fragile or dying or pitiful. Just be present. That's all anyone can really do for another person. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. Weston reached for June's hand, finding it warm and steady despite everything. The storm arrived like divine intervention, rolling across the hill country with the kind of fury that made people remember how small they really were. Lightning split, the sky in jagged silver veins, while thunder shook the earth, and rain fell in sheets so thick it turned the world grey and formless. Weston was reviewing hospital blueprints when his phone rang at 3 a.m. Miguel's voice crackled through static and interference. "Boss, we got problems. That old fence line between your property and the Henderson place is down, livestock scattered everywhere, and some of your prize horses are missing." "How bad?" "Bad. Enough. But there's more. That storm hit the north section hard. Trees down, power lines snapped, and boss, that girl's place took a beating." Weston was pulling on his boots before Miguel finished speaking. The storm was still raging, turning the roads into rivers of mud, but something deeper than duty drove him toward June's cabin. The broken fence, the symbolic barrier between their worlds, suddenly seemed like an omen he couldn't ignore. He found chaos when he arrived. A massive oak had fallen across June's roof, crushing one corner of the cabin and leaving a gaping hole that welcomed the driving rain. Her makeshift animal enclosures were destroyed, their occupants scattered into the storm. June herself stood in the wreckage, soaked to the skin, trying to coax the injured hawk from beneath a pile of debris. "June!" Weston shouted over the wind. She looked up, her hair plastered to her head, clothes clinging to her slight frame. In the lightning's intermittent glare, she looked almost ethereal, a spirit of the storm itself. "The animals!" she called back. "They're scared. Some are hurt." Without thinking, Weston waded into the flood of her small yard. The baby rabbits huddled in their overturned box, soaked and trembling. The one-legged crow perched precariously on a fence post, unable to fly to safety. The raccoon with the bandaged paw had taken shelter under what remained of June's porch. "We need to get them to safety," June said, gathering the rabbits against her chest. "We need to get you to safety." Weston countered, but he was already helping her round up the displaced creatures. For the next hour, they worked as a team in conditions that should have sent any reasonable person indoors. Weston found himself crawling under collapsed fencing to retrieve frightened animals, his expensive clothes ruined beyond redemption. June moved with urgent purpose despite her condition, her love for the creatures overriding concern for her own safety. They transferred the animals to Weston's truck, creating a Noah's Ark of wounded wildlife. The hawk rested in a carrier June had salvaged from the wreckage, while the rabbits shared a box with the raccoon. The crow perched on the dashboard, occasionally letting out indignant squawks at their circumstances. My place, Weston said as they loaded the last of June's essential belongings. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. June hesitated, looking back at her destroyed home. The cabin leaned drunkenly under the weight of the fallen tree, rain pouring through the broken roof onto everything she'd built over 8 years. It's just things, she said finally, but Weston caught the tremor in her voice. No, he said quietly, it's your life, and we're going to rebuild it. The ride to Weston's ranch house was surreal. A wealthy man and a poor woman, sharing the cab of a muddy truck with a collection of rescued animals, united by circumstance and something deeper than either was ready to name. At the ranch house, they established a temporary animal hospital in Weston's climate-controlled garage. June worked with quiet efficiency, checking each creature for injuries, while Weston fetched supplies and followed her instructions. His 12,000-square-foot house felt absurdly large compared to the simple task of caring for a handful of wounded animals. The hawk's wing is healing well, June reported, examining the bird by the light of an expensive work lamp. Stress from the storm, but nothing new damage. And you? Weston asked, noting how she'd grown pale in the artificial light. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The exertion of the rescue, combined with the emotional toll of losing her home, had taken a visible toll. She moved more carefully now, taking deeper breaths, occasionally pressing her hand to her chest when she thought he wasn't looking. You should rest, Weston said, after I make sure everyone's settled. It was nearly dawn when June finally allowed herself to sit down, accepting a cup of coffee in Weston's palatial kitchen. She looked impossibly small at his massive dining table, but her presence somehow filled the space in a way all his expensive furnishings never had. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For coming, for helping, for not caring about your clothes or your truck or what people might say about the wealthy Mr. Hale wallowing in the mud to save some worthless animals. They're not worthless. No, June agreed, her eyes meeting his directly. Neither are the people who care about them. Outside, the storm was finally breaking, first light revealing a transformed landscape. The fence between their properties lay in twisted ruins, but Weston realized that the real barriers, those built of class and assumption and fear, had been washed away in the flood. The handmade wind chime sang in the morning breeze, its melody created from salvaged materials June had gathered during their cleanup efforts. She'd crafted it from bent spoons rescued from her destroyed cabin, pieces of colored glass worn smooth by the storm, and strips of metal that had once been part of her damaged roof. Hanging from the oak tree near Weston's back porch, it transformed debris into music, a perfect metaphor for June's gift of finding beauty in brokenness. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and June had settled into the guest quarters of Weston's ranch house with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else. She'd refused his offer of the master guest suite, choosing instead a modest room near the kitchen where she could tend to her recovering animals without disturbing the household's routines. Weston found himself changing his own routines to accommodate her presence. He rose earlier to share coffee before she began her morning rounds with the animals. He lingered in the kitchen during meal preparation, drawn by the simple domesticity of watching someone cook with love rather than obligation. His sterile house had come alive in ways he hadn't thought possible. The hawk's ready to fly, June announced, emerging from the garage where she'd been checking on their patients. His wing's strong enough now. We should release him today. If you want to. I thought you might like to see him go free. There was something in her voice, a note of significance that suggested this was more than just releasing a bird. Weston had learned to listen for June's subtle invitations, the way she offered deeper meaning through simple gestures. They drove to a meadow on the far edge of his property, where wildflowers had begun to bloom despite the recent devastation. June carried the hawk in its travel cage, speaking to it in the soft tones that seemed to calm every creature she touched. "Ready?" she asked, positioning herself in the center of the clearing. Weston nodded, though he found himself reluctant to. see the bird leave. Over the past weeks, caring for these animals alongside June had given his life a purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. June opened the cage door and stepped back. For a moment, the hawk remained still, as if unsure whether freedom was real or illusion. Then, with a powerful thrust of wings, it launched itself into the blue sky, circling once over their heads before soaring toward the horizon. "He'll find his mate," June said with quiet satisfaction. "They mate for life, hawks do. She's been waiting." Something in her words made Weston look at her more closely. June stood silhouetted against the wildflower meadow, the wind chimes' materials glinting, in the morning sun, and he realized with startling clarity that he was looking at the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Not beautiful in the conventional sense that graced magazine covers or society pages, but beautiful in the way of growing things, natural, essential, impossible to replicate or replace. "June," he said, and something in his voice made her turn. Their eyes met across the meadow, and in that moment, all the careful boundaries they'd maintained crumbled like old fences. The weeks of shared coffee and rescued animals, of honest conversations and comfortable silences, had built something neither had expected or planned. "I'm falling in love with you," Weston said, the words emerging without permission or preparation. June's smile was radiant and heartbreaking at once. "I was hoping you'd figure that out. How long have you known? Since you helped me save the rabbits in the storm, since you ruined your expensive clothes for animals that most people would consider worthless, since you looked at my broken cabin and promised to rebuild it." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "But mostly since you started looking at me like I mattered more than your reputation." Weston reached for her hands, finding them warm and steady despite everything uncertain in their future. "I've never felt like this before, not even close. Neither have I, and it scares me. Because of your heart, because of yours." June's honesty was devastating and liberating. "I don't have forever to offer you, Weston. I don't have security or social standing or any of the things a man like you probably needs in a partner. What do you have right now? This moment. Whatever time we're given, however long or short it might be." Her voice grew soft but certain. "And love. I have love that's real and deep and not dependent on bank accounts or public opinion." Weston pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how her slight frame seemed to anchor him in ways he'd never imagined possible. "I choose you," he said simply. "Whatever comes, whatever people say, whatever challenges we face, I choose you." Their first kiss happened surrounded by wildflowers, with the wind chime singing its song of beauty from brokenness. It was tender and desperate and full of the knowledge that they were claiming something precious in a world that rarely protected such gifts. When they finally broke apart, June rested her forehead against his. "We're going to have to be brave," she whispered. "We're going to have to be everything," Weston replied. Above them, the hawk circled once more before disappearing into the vast Texas sky, free and whole, and ready to find its mate who had been patiently waiting. The medical chart lay on Dr. Patricia Hensley's desk like a death sentence, its clinical language failing to capture the devastation contained within its pages. Weston stared at the folder without opening it, knowing that once he read the contents, their carefully constructed hope would crumble into dust. June had collapsed 3 days earlier while feeding the baby rabbits in the garage. One moment she was speaking softly to the animals. The next, she was on the concrete floor, her face grey with pain, her breathing shallow and irregular. Weston had carried her to his truck with hands that shook, driving to the county hospital with a desperation that made speed limits meaningless. "Mr. Hale," Dr. Hensley said gently, "I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. Just tell me she's going to be all right." The doctor's expression was compassionate but firm. "Miss Marlowe has cardiomyopathy, a condition where the heart muscle becomes enlarged and weakened. In her case, it appears to be genetic, likely inherited from her grandmother." Weston felt the world tilt on its axis. Can it be treated? The condition is manageable in early stages: medication, lifestyle changes, regular monitoring. But Miss Marlowe's case is advanced. Based on these test results, I'd estimate she's been living with significant symptoms for at least 2 years. She never said anything. People with heart conditions often adapt gradually to their limitations. They learn to work around the symptoms, to hide the fatigue and shortness of breath. It becomes a way of life. Dr. Hensley opened the chart, pointing to numbers that meant nothing to Weston, but clearly carried grave significance to her trained eye. Her ejection fraction is severely reduced. The heart is pumping at roughly 30% of normal capacity. What does that mean? It means her heart is failing, Mr. Hale. Not immediately, but progressively. With aggressive treatment, medication, possible surgical intervention, lifestyle modifications, we might slow the progression. Might. The doctor's hesitation spoke volumes. In cases this advanced, we're typically looking at months rather than years. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but you both need to understand the reality of what we're facing. Weston felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been signing an eviction notice. Now the woman he loved was dying, and all his wealth couldn't change the diagnosis written in stark medical terminology. What about a transplant? Miss Marlowe would need to be evaluated by a specialist team. The process is lengthy, expensive, and there's no guarantee she'd qualify. Even if she did, donor hearts are scarce, and the waiting list is long. Money's not an issue. This isn't about money, Mr. Hale. It's about medical suitability, available organs, and time. Based on Miss Marlowe's current condition and prognosis, I'd be surprised if she'd qualify for the transplant list. The words hit him like physical blows. Weston had spent his adult life believing that sufficient resources could solve any problem, that enough money could buy safety, health, happiness. The medical chart in front of him represented the first challenge his wealth couldn't overcome. How long? It's impossible to say precisely. With treatment, possibly 6 months to a year. Without treatment, Dr. Hensley's voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between them. I want the best cardiac specialists money can hire. Cleveland Clinic, Mayo, wherever the top doctors practice. Cost is irrelevant. Mr. Hale, I understand your desire to explore every option. But sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept what can't be changed and focus on making the time that remains as meaningful as possible. You're telling me to give up. I'm telling you to love her, to be present with her, to help her live fully in whatever time she has left. When Weston returned to June's hospital room, he found her sitting up in bed, looking remarkably peaceful for someone who just received a terminal diagnosis. She'd insisted on seeing Dr. Hensley alone first, claiming she needed to understand her situation before discussing it with him. You talked to the doctor, she said. It wasn't a question. June, it's all right. I've known for a while that this day would come. Hearts don't hide their secrets forever. Weston pulled his chair close to her bedside, taking her hand in both of his. We'll fight this. Best doctors, experimental treatments, whatever it takes. Weston. Her voice was gentle but firm. I need you to hear me. Really hear me. This isn't a fight we can win with money or determination or stubbornness. This is my heart giving out, and all the specialists in the world can't change that. I can't lose you. Not now, not when I've just found you. Tears ran down June's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. You're not losing me. Love doesn't die. When hearts stop beating. But if you spend whatever time we have left trying to fix something that can't be fixed, then we'll both lose what matters most. Which is? This moment, this conversation, the chance to love each other completely while we can. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over the hill country they both loved, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would fade too soon, Like everything beautiful in the world, the expensive treatment brochure arrived by express mail from the Mayo Clinic, its glossy pages showcasing state-of-the-art cardiac facilities and revolutionary procedures that promised hope where none had existed before. Weston spread the materials across his dining room table like battle plans, highlighting procedures and calculating costs with the focused intensity of a general preparing for war. Mechanical assist devices, he read aloud to June, who sat curled in his leather chair with the one-legged crow perched on her shoulder. Bridge therapy while waiting for transplant. Success rates of 60% or higher in qualified candidates. June didn't look up from the letter she was writing, one of dozens she'd been composing since returning from the hospital. Her correspondence included thank-you notes to neighbors who'd helped during the storm, instructions for caring for her rescued animals, and what appeared to be farewell messages to people she'd touched throughout her quiet life. "June, are you listening to this?" "I'm listening." Her voice carried the patient tone of someone humoring a loved one's impossible dreams. "But I'm not interested." "How can you not be interested? This could give us years together." June sat down, her pen, and looked at him directly. "At what cost? Money's not—" "I'm not talking about money, Weston. I'm talking about what kind of life we'd have. Look at that brochure. Really look at it." Weston studied the images more carefully, seeing beyond the cheerful marketing copy to the reality beneath. Patients connected to machines, families gathered. Around hospital beds, the sterile environment of intensive care units. The success stories featured people celebrating milestones measured in months rather than decades. 60% success rate sounds promising, he said, grasping for optimism. Success at what? Keeping my heart beating a little longer while I'm tethered to machines, spending whatever time I have left in hospitals instead of living? But you'd be alive. June stood and walked to the window, where her makeshift animal sanctuary had taken shape in Weston's garage. The baby rabbits were nearly ready for release, their eyes bright and movements confident. The raccoon had regained full use of its paw and spent most days exploring the ranch under June's watchful supervision. "There's a difference between being alive and living," she said quietly. "Those animals out there, they don't cling to existence at any cost. When it's time to let go, they let go with dignity. You're not an animal. No, but I can learn from them. They understand something we've forgotten, that a life lived fully for a short time is better than a life prolonged without purpose or joy." Weston joined her at the window, frustration and fear warring in his chest. "So you're just giving up?" "I'm choosing how to spend whatever time I have left. There's a difference." The conversation that followed was their first real fight, born of love and terror in equal measure. Weston argued for aggressive treatment, for fighting until the very end, for refusing to accept what couldn't be changed. June countered with gentle stubbornness, insisting that quality mattered more than quantity, that dying with dignity was preferable to living without it. "I won't watch you die," Weston said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "Then don't watch me die. Watch me live." "For how long? 6 months? 8? What kind of future can we build in such a short time?" June moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "The same future anyone builds day by day. None of us know how long we have, Weston. The only difference is that I have a clearer sense of my timeline. I need more time with you." "Then stop wasting the time we have fighting about the time we don't have." That evening, Weston found himself in Clay's study, surrounded by hospital blueprints and treatment brochures, trying to reconcile his desire to save June with her determination to live on her own terms. The mahogany desk seemed to watch him, with Clay's patient wisdom, and he could almost hear his brother's voice asking the question that mattered most. What would love do? Clay had always understood that loving someone meant respecting their choices, even when those choices broke your heart, especially then. Weston gathered the treatment brochures and dropped them in the wastebasket. Then he returned to the living room, where June was teaching the crow to eat from her hand. "What do you want to do?" he asked simply. June's smile was radiant. I want to plant the wildflower garden we started. I want to see you break ground on Clay's hospital. I want to wake up every morning in your arms for as long as my heart keeps beating. I want to live every day like it matters. And the medical treatment? Basic maintenance. Medication to keep me comfortable. Regular checkups to monitor progression. But no heroic measures, no last-ditch interventions. When my heart decides it's time to stop, I want to let it stop peacefully. I don't know how to do this, Weston admitted. Neither do I, but we'll figure it out together. Outside, the sun set over their wildflower meadow, where new blooms were already pushing through the soil, reaching toward whatever light they could find. June's garden journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with careful notations in her neat handwriting. Each entry documented not just what she'd planted and where, but why. The stories behind every seed, the hope contained in every bloom. Indian paintbrush for courage, read one entry. Evening primrose for patience in dark times. The journal had become a roadmap of legacy, a guide for continuing her work long after her hands could no longer tend the soil. Weston found her sitting in the morning sunshine, writing in the journal with the focused attention she brought to everything important. 3 months had passed since her diagnosis, and while her physical strength had noticeably diminished, her spirit seemed to burn brighter each day. "Making plans?" he asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "Memory projects," June corrected, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I want to leave instructions for everything. Which wildflowers bloom when, where the animals like to nest, how to care for the ones that might need help." She turned to a page titled "For Weston," and his throat tightened at the care evident in every word. Detailed instructions for maintaining the wildflower meadows, contact information for wildlife rehabilitation centers, even recipes for the herbal teas she brewed from plants she'd cultivated. "You're writing me a manual for living without you. I'm writing you a manual for continuing what we started together." June's voice was gentle but firm. "This garden, these animals, Clay's hospital, they're all connected. They're all about taking care of things that need care." Over the following weeks, they worked together on what June called their living legacy projects. She taught Weston to identify the calls of different birds, to recognize which plants needed more water and which thrived on neglect. They documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, creating a record of the small sanctuary they'd built together. The hospital project had taken on new urgency. Weston threw himself into the planning with a passion that surprised his architects and contractors. June attended every meeting she felt strong enough for, offering suggestions about making the space welcoming for children and families. Her insights about creating beauty on a limited budget proved invaluable. "Children need something to wonder at when they're scared," she said during one planning session. "Not expensive art or fancy decorations, but real things. Windows where they can watch birds, gardens they can help tend when they're feeling better." "That could complicate the construction timeline," the architect warned. "Then we complicate it," Weston said firmly. "Wonder doesn't follow schedules." June smiled at his words, recognizing her own philosophy reflected in his response. Slowly, patiently, she was teaching him to value things that couldn't be measured in dollars or timelines. There, evenings fell into a rhythm of gentle purpose. While Weston reviewed hospital plans and permits, June continued her correspondence project. Letters to be opened on future anniversaries, birthday cards for celebrations she wouldn't see, notes of encouragement for moments when grief might overwhelm hope. "You're going to think I'm sentimental," she said one evening, sealing an envelope marked "For Weston's birthday, year 2. "I think you're the wisest person I've ever known." Wisdom isn't about knowing more things. It's about understanding what matters and what doesn't. June organized the letters in a wooden box she'd found at a thrift store, each one labeled for a specific occasion or need. "What matters is love, connection, the marks we leave on each other's hearts. Everything else is just noise." The garden journal had grown into something larger, a philosophy of living that went beyond mere survival. June documented not just practical information, but the deeper lessons learned from working with soil and seasons, from caring for wounded creatures, from finding joy in simple moments. True wealth, she wrote in one entry that made Weston's chest tight, isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you nurture. A garden that feeds both body and soul is worth more than gold. A kindness that costs nothing but changes everything is the most profitable investment. Love that asks for nothing but gives everything is the only currency that matters in the end. As autumn deepened into winter, June's energy ebbed like a retreating tide. But even as her physical strength diminished, her impact on Weston's transformation became more pronounced. He found himself making decisions based not on profit margins, but on human benefit. He funded the local animal shelter, donated equipment to the school district, quietly paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford care. "You're becoming the man Clay always believed you could be," June told him one evening as they watched the sun set from their wildflower meadow. "I'm becoming the man you showed me how to be. I didn't show you anything that wasn't already there. I just helped you remember what you'd forgotten." The garden journal lay between them, its pages full of practical wisdom and deeper truths. Weston realized that June had been preparing him not just to tend flowers and care for animals, but to live with purpose and meaning long after she was gone. "Promise me something," June said, her voice growing soft with fatigue. "Anything. Promise me you'll keep growing things. Not just the hospital or the garden, but yourself. Keep becoming more generous, more patient, more willing to see wonder. In ordinary moments, I promise. And promise me you'll remember that love doesn't end when hearts stop beating. It just changes form." The simple gold wedding ring lay in Weston's palm like a prayer made tangible. He'd found it that morning in an antique shop in town. Not expensive by his standards, but perfect in its unadorned honesty. No diamonds or elaborate settings, just a band of pure gold that caught the light and reflected it back with quiet beauty. June was napping in the garden when he returned home, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt despite the mild winter afternoon. Her breathing was shallower now, her color more fragile, but she'd insisted on spending time among the dormant wildflowers. "They're just resting," she'd said when he worried about her sitting in the cold. "Come spring they'll remember how to bloom." "June," he said softly, settling beside her on the bench they'd positioned to catch the afternoon sun. She opened her eyes, and her smile still had the power to make his heart race. "You look like a man with something important on his mind." "I want to marry you." June's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's very sudden." "Is it? We've been living like married people for months. I love you, you love me, and we're facing whatever comes together. The only thing missing is making it official." "Weston," her voice carried gentle warning, "I'm not going to be anyone's wife for very long. Then I want to be your husband for however long we have." He opened his hand, revealing the simple ring. "I know it's not much. It's perfect." June picked up the ring, turning it in the sunlight. "But are you sure? Marriage means sharing everything, sickness and health, better and worse. In our case, there's going to be a lot more worse than better." "There's going to be love," Weston said simply. "That's enough." June slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. "Then yes, I'll marry you." They planned the ceremony for the following weekend, keeping it simple despite Weston's wealth and connections. June wanted wildflowers instead of expensive arrangements, the ranch instead of a church, close friends instead of society guests. Pastor Williams agreed to perform the service in their meadow, among the dormant plants that would bloom again come spring. The guest list was small but meaningful. Miguel and his wife Rosa, who'd become like family to both of them. Dr. Hensley, who'd agreed to be present in case June needed medical attention. Tom Bradley from the feed store, Martha Henderson, and several other townspeople who'd come to respect June's quiet dignity. Even Victoria Ashford attended, though her expression suggested she still couldn't quite understand what Weston saw in his unconventional bride. June wore a simple white dress she'd found at a consignment shop, its vintage, cut complementing her delicate frame. Weston chose a navy suit, not because Victoria had once recommended it, but because June said it brought out his eyes. She carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers from their own garden, their muted colors beautiful in their own right. The ceremony itself was brief but profound. Pastor William spoke about love that transcends circumstances, about choosing joy in the face of uncertainty, about the courage required to commit when the future holds no guarantees. Do you, Weston, take June to be your wife, to love and cherish her for whatever time you're given together? I do. And do you, June, take Weston to be your husband, promising to share your life with him completely, holding nothing back? I do. When they exchanged rings, June's hands were steady despite everything. The simple gold band looked right on Weston's finger, unpretentious, honest, real, in a way his expensive watches and cufflinks had never been. You may kiss your bride. Their kiss was tender and desperate, witnessed by friends who understood. They were celebrating something both joyous and heartbreaking. When they broke apart, June's eyes were bright with tears and laughter. "Mrs. Hale," Weston whispered against her forehead. "I like the sound of that." The reception took place on Weston's back porch, where Rosa had prepared a feast that transformed simple ingredients into something magnificent. The wind chime June had made sang in the breeze, providing music for their first dance as husband and wife. They swayed together slowly, carefully, Weston supporting June when her strength wavered. "Thank you," she murmured against his chest. "For what?" "For giving me the gift of being your wife, for letting me belong to someone completely, even if it's just for a little while. You're not borrowing time, June. You're my wife for as long as love lasts, which is forever." As the sun set over their wildflower meadow, the small gathering shared stories and laughter that would become precious memories. Miguel played guitar, while Rosa sang Mexican love songs that needed no translation. Dr. Hensley shared stories from her years of practicing medicine, about the courage she'd witnessed in ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. But the most beautiful moment came when June stood to thank their guests, her voice clear and strong despite her physical frailty. "Today has been perfect, not because everything went according to plan, but because we chose to celebrate love in the face of uncertainty. That's what life is, choosing love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation. Thank you for witnessing our choice." That night, as they lay in bed as husband and wife for the first time, June traced patterns on Weston's chest with fingers that wore a wedding ring. "No regrets?" she asked. "Only that we didn't do this sooner. We did it exactly when we were supposed to." Perfect timing isn't about calendars, it's about readiness. The sunset photograph would become Weston's most treasured possession, though neither of them knew it when June asked him to take one last picture of them together. She'd grown noticeably weaker since their wedding 2 months earlier, but on this particular evening in late February, she'd felt strong enough to walk to their wildflower meadow to check for the first signs of spring. "The blue bonnets will be early this year," she said, pointing to tiny green shoots barely visible among the brown winter grass. "Look, they're already pushing through." Weston helped her settle on their bench, noting how carefully she moved, how she paused to catch her breath after even small exertions. Dr. Hensley had warned them that the end stages would come quickly. When they came, but June faced each day with the same quiet grace she'd shown since her diagnosis. "Take our picture," June said, handing him her old camera, a simple point-and-shoot she'd owned for years. "I want to remember this sunset. We can take hundreds of pictures, this one, right now, while the light is perfect." Weston positioned the camera to capture both of them with the setting sun behind them, its golden light turning everything magical. June leaned against his shoulder, her smile radiant despite her obvious fatigue. When he looked at the image on the camera's small screen, he saw two people who had found something rare and precious, love that transcended circumstances. "Perfect," June whispered, studying the photo. "That's how I want you to remember us." 3 days later, June's condition took a sharp turn. She woke with chest pain and difficulty breathing that even her medications couldn't ease. By the time they reached the hospital, her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made Weston's hands shake as he helped her from the truck. "Her heart is failing more rapidly than we expected," Dr. Hensley explained after examining June. "We can make her comfortable, but there's nothing more we can do medically." "How long?" Weston asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Days, maybe a week." June insisted on going home. "I want to die where I've been living," she said simply, "surrounded by things that matter." They set up a hospital bed in the living room, where June could see both the wildflower meadow through one window and her rescued animals through another. The one-legged crow had claimed permanent residence on the porch, refusing all attempts at release. The baby rabbits, now grown, visited the yard each evening as if checking on their former caretaker. Friends came to say goodbye. Miguel and Rosa brought homemade soup and sat quietly with June, sharing memories of the changes they'd witnessed at the ranch. Pastor Williams offered prayers and comfort, marveling at June's peaceful acceptance of what was coming. Even Martha Henderson visited, her usual gossip replaced by genuine affection for the woman who changed so many lives. "I misjudged you," Martha admitted, holding June's hand. "You brought something to this town that we didn't know we needed." "Everyone brings something," June replied. "Sometimes it just takes time to see what it is." Victoria Ashford's visit surprised everyone, including herself. She brought an expensive arrangement of hothouse flowers, which June accepted graciously despite preferring wildflowers. "I never understood what Weston saw in you," Victoria said with uncharacteristic honesty. "I thought you were after his money." "I was after his heart," June said gently. Turned out that was much more valuable. As June's strength ebbed, she and Weston fell into a rhythm of shared quietness. They talked when she felt strong enough, but mostly they simply existed together, his hand in hers, her breathing gradually becoming more labored, but never panicked. "Read to me," June requested on what would be her last night. Weston opened her garden journal to a random page and read her own words back to her. "True wealth isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you nurture. A garden that feeds both body and soul is worth more than gold." "Do you believe that now?" June asked. "I believe everything you taught me. Then I can rest easy." June died at sunrise, quietly and peacefully, with Weston holding her hand and the one-legged crow keeping vigil on the windowsill. Her last words were, "Take care of the garden." The funeral was held in the wildflower meadow, exactly as June had requested. Pastor Williams spoke about lives that touch others like ripples on water, spreading outward in ways we never fully comprehend. The entire town seemed to attend, along with people June had helped over the years, families whose animals she'd cared for, children she'd taught about wildflowers, neighbors who'd benefited from her quiet generosity. Weston stood beside the grave they dug among the dormant bluebonnets, wearing his simple wedding ring and holding the sunset photograph. The image captured everything he wanted to remember: June's radiant smile, the golden light, the moment when their love had felt infinite despite their limited time. Miguel approached as the last mourners departed. "She changed you, boss. Changed all of us." "She showed me what I'd forgotten," Weston replied, "how to see wonder in ordinary things, how to love without counting the cost." "What now?" Weston looked across the meadow, where tiny green shoots were already pushing through the earth, reaching towards spring. In a few months, this entire field would explode with color, June's final gift to the world. "Now I keep growing things," he said simply. "I keep her promises." 6 months after June's death, the memorial garden bloomed with a riot of color that took Weston's breath away. Blue bonnets carpeted the meadow like a blue sea, while Indian paintbrush added splashes of red. Fire. Evening primrose waited for dusk to unfold their pale petals, and black-eyed Susans nodded in the morning breeze. Every seed June had planted, every hope she'd nursed through difficult seasons had come to glorious fruition. The memorial garden occupied 10 acres of what had once been Weston's most remote pasture. He'd commissioned a simple stone marker that read, "June Marlowe Hale." She taught us how to bloom where we were planted. But the real memorial was the living landscape itself, a testament to faith in future seasons and the patient work of love. Families came daily to walk the winding paths Weston had created through the wildflowers. Children chased butterflies, while parents found peaceful moments on benches positioned to catch the best light. The one-legged crow still held court near June's favorite spot, accepting offerings of seeds from young visitors who'd heard stories of the woman who rescued wounded creatures. "Mr. Hale," a voice interrupted his morning contemplation. Sarah Chen, the architect for Clay's hospital project, approached with rolled blueprints under her arm. "I wanted to show you the latest revisions." They spread the plans on a picnic table Weston had installed for such purposes. The children's hospital had evolved far beyond Clay's original vision, incorporating everything June had suggested about creating spaces that welcomed rather than intimidated. Healing gardens surrounded the building with indoor courtyards where patients could tend plants as part of their recovery. Wide windows brought the outside in, and skylights ensured that natural light reached even the most interior spaces. "The contractors say we can break ground next month," Sarah reported. "Full completion in 18 months. The funding secured, and then some. Word got out about what you're building, and donations started pouring in. Seems like people were waiting for someone to show them how to invest in hope." Weston nodded, unsurprised. June had been right about the hunger for meaningful purpose that existed beneath the surface of most lives. People wanted to contribute to something larger than themselves. They just needed someone to show them how. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Hensley. "New patient in the ER, injured fox. Can you come?" Weston smiled, gathering the blueprints. "Rain check on the rest of this. I have a patient to see." The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had grown from June's humble beginning into a regional resource. Weston had hired trained veterinarians and wildlife specialists, but he still personally responded to calls about injured animals. It was his way of honoring June's memory while continuing her work. He found the young fox in the examination room, its legs splintered and eyes alert despite obvious pain. The child who'd brought it, a girl of maybe 8, waited anxiously with her parents. "Will Rusty be okay?" the girl asked. "Rusty's going to be fine," Weston assured her. "We'll take good care of him until his leg heals, then release him back to the wild where he belongs. Just like the lady used to do, just like that." After arranging care for the fox, Weston drove home through town, noting changes that had occurred since June's death. Tom Bradley's feed store now carried supplies for backyard wildlife rehabilitation. The library had added a section of books about native plants and sustainable gardening. Most telling of all, several empty lots had been converted into community gardens where neighbors worked together to grow food and flowers. June's influence rippled outward in ways she never could have imagined. Her simple philosophy of caring for what needed care had infected an entire community with purposeful generosity. At home, Weston found a package waiting on his doorstep, another letter from June, timed for the 6-month anniversary of her death. He'd grown to treasure these scheduled surprises, her voice reaching across the months to comfort and guide him through grief. "My dearest husband," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means 6 months have passed since I left you. I hope the wildflowers are blooming beautifully. I hope you're remembering to see wonder in ordinary moments. Most of all, I hope you understand now what I tried to teach you about true wealth." Weston paused, looking out at the memorial garden, where the evening light was beginning to gild the wildflower petals. A family walked the paths, their children's laughter carrying on the breeze. In the distance, construction equipment prepared the site for Clay's hospital. His phone showed 17 missed calls from people seeking help with injured animals or advice about native plantings. True wealth, the letter continued, isn't measured in bank accounts or possessions. It's measured in the lives you touch, the growth you nurture, the love you give freely without expecting return. You were already wealthy when I met you, Weston. You just didn't know how to count your riches. Now you do. You've learned to see value in things that can't be bought or sold. You've discovered that the most profitable investments are made with your heart rather than your wallet. You've become the man Clay always believed you could be, the man I fell in love with beneath all that armor. Keep growing things, my love. Keep blooming where you're planted. Keep showing others that true wealth begins when you stop counting your money and start making your life count. As darkness fell, Weston walked through the memorial garden, one. Last time, guided by solar lights that marked the winding paths, the wildflowers released their evening fragrances, and somewhere in the distance, the call of a night bird echoed across the hills. He was, Weston realized, the wealthiest man in Texas.